let's get started. Happy fake spring. Got another wave of snow and all that fun stuff today. So we are at our second to last class meeting for the quarter. So we are getting really close to the end, and we are spending some time for today and Friday just to tie up some loose ends, to talk about the Lloyd reading, and to prepare you for the final assignments that we're doing in the course. So I want to start by giving you sort of a glance look at the calendar for the remaining days. We'll be wrapping up our discussion on limits of listening today and Friday. I'll also give this kind of broader course wrap up about the things we've been talking about. The listening debrief assignment that we talked about last class, and I gave you the opportunity to do a conversation about, is due by midnight on the 19th. Also, those final two quizzes covering those last 2 weeks of readings are also due on the 19th. And the extra credit opportunity, which adds 20 points or 2% to your grade if you choose to do it, is also by that time. The 19th is also the deadline to turn in any missing assignments, including makeup assignments if you have missed more than 3 class periods. I definitely recommend just doing what you need there. We don't have any sort of meeting for the final exam day. That's instead just an opportunity for you to catch up on the remaining things that you need to do for the course. So I know you're juggling a lot. I just wanted to be as transparent as possible about what we're looking for from the course at this final stage. Last class, I gave you the opportunity to share some stories and experiences that were a way of connecting to the listening debrief activity. Again, this is kind of a parallel of the first essay that I asked you to do in the class, where now you're sort of using these skills you've learned about listening, the listening process, to reflect on that experience. And then we started to hit on some points on the Lloyd article, and I'm going to pick up where we left off to talk about the Lloyd reading and give you the chance in groups to work through this reading as well. So what I want us to do as your part 1 of attendance is to take some time to write and type on your own. If you had your conversation on Monday, what was the story? So for those of you that were not here face-to-face or on Zoom on Monday, similar to last time, you are welcome to find like a 15 to 20 minute conversation with somebody, maybe a friend, a family member, somebody close to you, that you can use for this assignment. So if you didn't have the chance to participate in the conversation on Monday, I encourage you to take some time to brainstorm and think about when you could have this conversation. And if you had this conversation on Monday, what were some of the changes you noticed in your own listening? What did you do differently? What stood out to you as maybe something unique or different about the approach? And then lastly, what are some main ideas that you've learned for the course that might relate to listening or the listening process? So take some time to work on those, and then we'll talk about things together. Give you a couple more minutes to continue to brainstorm and to work through this. Go ahead and wrap up your current thought or idea. You're not locked into this stage, but I did want to use this as an opportunity for you to brainstorm and start to think about the things that you might be writing and talking about as we gear up for the final essay. So since I know there are some folks that weren't here on Monday, just as a quick reminder about how to access this assignment and the expectations for this assignment, you'll see it's right here on Canvas under the debrief activity. Again, click here for the prompt. I'm asking you again to use either conversation that you've had in class or an outside conversation, somebody like a friend or family member, to again summarize and explain the conversation in your own words. Compare what you observed from your listening this time around to the listening assessment assignment, the first listening assignment you did in the class. And then 3, the major things that you've learned about listening over the course of the class. So you might be thinking about, for instance, listening as it relates to accessibility, listening as it relates to race, or whatever topics stand out to you. And again, a rubric is available for you. So the 19th is the hard deadline, just because I need to get grades in after the 19th. So I've sort of extended that out. So just know that that is coming up, and just that assignment is the last major writing thing that you need to do. Any questions about this? Anything else as we enter the final stretch? If questions come up at any point, please let me know. Again, I will look at drafts or outlines if you send them to me in advance. So last class, we talked about the key thesis of the Lloyd article, right? Justine Lloyd's article is sort of asking the question, what are the limits of listening? Again, we've talked a lot in this quarter about how listening can do a lot of good, it can help us to engage, to understand each other, to bridge gaps, and it's been under discussed when it comes to the communication process. And while that is true, right, we can't put listening on too high of a pedestal. It is not a cure for every single problem or social issue that we have, right? Look to what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, the degree of sort of international conflict that's occurring. Because of the geopolitical interests in the region, right, Russia's desire to expand, sort of refugee crisis and migration and violence that's happening, right, listening is not enough to resolve the overarching international history and context has created the problems that exist currently, right? So in this way, when we take structural or larger scale issues and say, you know what, we just need to listen, it places the responsibility onto individuals over the potential structural or institutional changes that might be necessary in order to deal with issues of fairness. Last class, we also went into this idea of the ear witness. When we think about listening in a historical context, right, oftentimes we imagine that there is this sort of historian or storyteller or person who has the ability to tell us and accurately shape the events of the past. And what we know, right, from history and our understanding of it, is that that's not how things play out. That oftentimes we find ourselves in situations in which how history has been interpreted has been skewed, right? And that we are getting these sort of imperfect human perspectives, points of view, and voices. Who is included in our accounts of history? Who's not, right? You see these kinds of debates and discussions happening a lot, particularly as it relates to things including Indigenous histories and ways in which Indigenous history might not be included in our textbooks, right? We actually have in our college today, we have a candidate who's this afternoon at 3 p.m. Coming here, I believe it's either in this room or right next door in Ackerman, who is sharing a project about the history of rodeos and sort of women in that time period in the rural West. So it's an example, right, of how we talk about history and use history in our own lives. And so Lloyd presents the ear witness as this kind of figure that we assume has this whole holistic account of history, but we know history is a lot more complicated. So we'll be further exploring some of the ideas from Lloyd, the limits of listening, and some of the ways that sort of pairing listening with action might look. So if we go back a few weeks and we talk about what we were saying with regard to listening as it relates to public communication, right, on social and political issues, you might remember that we talked about the idea of the public sphere, drawing from Jürgen Habermas's work, right? The public sphere is originally sort of viewed as this town square where people go off and they talk about the issues of the day. That the town square is a mode of democratic engagement that allows us to resolve and engage with issues that might be impacting our lives, right? Kind of a modern spin on it, right? The use of social media, liking, sharing, all of that stuff, have showed us that the public sphere has changed. We've, of course, shifted to a lot more online and remote ways of engaging in public communication, and that we're not necessarily listening to one another in the same way, right? So if that is the case, and we see listening as an opportunity for us to engage across difference in the public sphere context, we know that that has constraints. You might think back to the 4 styles of listening, including enclave and adversarial listening, right? And when we listen across difference, we're not necessarily listening because we are going to be persuaded or change our views a lot, because that can be very challenging, but instead to understand opposing views, better develop strategy, and so on, right? The sort of optimistic listening lets everybody come together doesn't really acknowledge the reality, right, of things like limited resources, irreconcilable conflict, and so on, right? So despite the opportunities for listening that we have, particularly as it relates to democratic participation, the opportunities for people to listen and participate are not equal, right? We talked about this earlier in the quarter when we talked about some things like race in media as it related to media ownership. Some of the issues related to accessibility. You might think again back to Nancy sharing her story in that clip from Trip Camp, not necessarily being understood by the large audience, but having somebody also with cerebral palsy who's able to share that story and sort of translate that experience, right? So what we interpret and read as listening is different depending on the individual, depending on the context, right? We talked about that a little bit as well. One kind of interesting observation from this week's reading actually goes back to Ratcliffe's work. Ratcliffe's piece was on this idea of rhetorical listening, an idea you could incorporate for your final paper if you choose to do so. The idea that we oftentimes will engage in listening as understanding it as a persuasive act, right? That listening has some impact or effect that we can start to parse out. So to some extent, right, while Lloyd is not saying we should eavesdrop and overhear everybody, and just listen in on all of our conversations, it's instead the idea that we find ourselves in situations where listening to the world around us helps us to understand and engage in social and civil issues. For instance, you might think back to the space and place reading on Gibraltar, the idea that physical location, that our proximity, that the culture, the conversations happening around us shape our own listening environment and context, and that we can better understand social difference, issues related to listening when we are attuned to and pay attention, right, to the world around us. That there's not this, figure that's the ear witness that's doing all the work for us, but that we have to actively think about how the listening that we're doing is impacting our lives and the lives of others. Right? So key kind of argument that's raised by Lloyd is that focusing on listening without changing social relationships is a major problem. If you say, well, hey, in our corporation, we need to focus on better listening. Sure, we can do that, but at the same time, if somebody is experiencing things like microaggressions, right, targeted, kind of racially charged or motivated comments that are derogatory towards somebody, at least listening isn't getting at the ways in which people might be hurt by people's behavior. So, in other words, right, one of the core observations, I think it's a good sort of summary of one of Lloyd's major arguments, is that we should care for, rather than cure, moments of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and misrepresentation to engage in the questions of what is left out and omitted in the technologization of listening, right? So in other words, right, if we say there is miscommunication, there is misunderstanding here, we need to fix it, we're missing why those things are happening, right? If somebody is misunderstanding, why are they misunderstanding? Maybe culture plays a role here. A word or some nonverbal communication means things that are different. For instance, sustained eye contact in the United States might be valued highly. In another country, particularly as it relates to eye contact with an authority figure, maybe it's seen as disrespectful. So when something is misunderstood, right, there's a lot at play in that middle space. Miscommunication. What does it mean that somebody didn't communicate their intent? Why is that? Are they uncomfortable doing so? Are there skills or things that we can do to make somebody feel more comfortable? Somebody is rushing and out of breath, right? And they show up late to a meeting because they're not able to access safe transportation, right? That's a big explanation for miscommunication. And misrepresentation, right? Why do we misrepresent or portray experiences in a way that might not be accurate? Sometimes there's intentionality there, where perspectives and views are intentionally misrepresented, right? The logical fallacy of the straw person is the idea that we portray an opposing perspective in as sort of negative of a light as possible, right? You watch any of the major national political conventions and they will just trash the other party and say, look how terrible their ideas are, right? It's the idea that we tend to portray other views in a way that makes them look ridiculous because it makes us look better. And instead to engage in the questions of what's left out or omitted, right? That when we listen and do listening, what's missing and what can we do to bridge those gaps? So listening isn't a perfect process. I think it's on us to embrace its imperfections and limits. So I think the move that Lloyd makes here, I think is a really interesting one, right? The idea that we can move from listening as cure to listening as care, right? We talked a lot about the process of active and empathetic listening, that listening takes a lot out of you, right? We're exposed to so much technology and information every single day. We find ourselves pretty exhausted by things like COVID and the sort of impacts that it's had, right? And listening is this really taxing process, and it's worth acknowledging it as such rather than saying, hey, we should all be good listeners, right? So listening does have potential. It can help us to resolve and deal with a lot of major social, political, and other issues that might come up, but it's not perfect. In fact, we might find ourselves with listeners in a similar manner to writer's block. We find ourselves trying to listen, trying to engage and understand other people, but we're hitting a wall, listening isn't getting us there. And instead, we can embrace failure. What can we learn from listening that doesn't go well? Not just to improve our own listening, but to think about what it means to communicate across difference. How can we better understand issues at play that are impacting listening? If somebody is overworked, exhausted, and underslept, listening is not going to do a whole lot. So what I want us to do now is I'll have two teams that are face-to-face, and then the folks that are on Zoom, I'll have you as a group of three work on the concluding section. What I would like each group to do is by either having one person type or write for the group with everybody's names on it, I'd like you to tackle one of these sections from the reading, Listening as Labor, which begins on page 480, and Listening for Disturbance Without Being Disturbed. It starts on page 482. And I'd like you to report on the key findings for this section, what observations Lloyd makes about listening, and how these observations might help us to become better listeners. So we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So we have 11 folks here today. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then folks on Zoom, we'll have you all work on the conclusion section. It has a section header and it starts a couple pages after Listening for the Disturbance. So do the same thing as the other groups just for that final section. Take some time, open up the reading and talk together about this section of the reading and some of the things that you're able to observe that stand out to you. Yeah.
Which section again?
Oh, yes. So listening is labor in this section in the first group, and listening for the disturbance without being disturbed. And Zoom folks are doing.
So you like.
I didn't lie to you. I didn't.
You lied.
I didn't lie. I just wasn't paying attention.
I don't think you've almost second guessed
She
myself.
gave me the-
about 10 more minutes to continue to work through this.
I just feel that's useful. I just finished reading it. I'm like, I don't really have away from it. It just felt like this article said this article said this. It doesn't really blend together. Just work to see it. It's just a bunch of words on paper. That doesn't. It's not clicking. Right. That was a little bit harder than just paying attention. Tedious to actually be involved with it. That's what I got from the first part of it.
Yeah.
I don't get it. I'm great at this thing. The half brain cell I have left is left.
I used to have a lot of it.
Even just like super rock around the bottom of my skull. It's pushing around.
We're at that point in the day, right? It doesn't need to be perfect. It's just a starting point for us to continue to talk about.
Okay, okay. Shares two. What else?
Let's go. It does talk about how silence, I like how it talks about how silence is also kind of this thing. Yeah, like how good silence can be in conversation.
And how listening shouldn't like someone's dominating. Like it shouldn't be listener versus hearer. It should be like symbiotic type of thing.
Yeah. Symbiotic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's go.
And like, yeah, it helps like underrepresented.
take a bit, about 5 more minutes to continue working on your thoughts. It doesn't need to be perfect, just a starting point for us to talk about things a little bit more.
I'm trying
I
to
mean,
analyze a quote.
one way of thinking about it is, and I think this was a skill that I was taught, is that it's not always that you don't get it. Sometimes that it's written.
This is written
And there's enough important stuff that's still worth looking at, but we have to kind of tackle it together.
Oh, and I was actually. That's what I was. This is an ethical response. Oh, Sorry. Sorry to burst your bubble.
Keep
No,
going.
no, it's like-
He's
Sorry to burst your bubble.
Having it twice.
Yeah, it's just that important. We actually have to say. This is just. Yes. To the back here. Oh.
Oh, yeah, like. it was like something. Oh, yeah, like- It was like disrespecting you. Oh.
Go ahead and wrap up what you're currently working on. Have one person ready to share. Again, this is a work in progress.
I know.
It's not what we want.
So we need to change that. Society.
So let's start with this first section. Again, as I mentioned to the group over here, I think there are a lot of parts of this reading that are kind of complicated, a little bit convoluted, not superbly written. As I mentioned to the group on this side, right? A trick that I learned is that not being able to get through or understand everything in a reading, not a sign about your own intelligence. Sometimes it's just a sign of poor writing. But I do think that this article does have some worthwhile things to cover and to talk about. So I wanted us to tackle this together to try to explore a little bit more. So I'd like you to just share what they were able to glean and gather in response to these questions for a starting point for us to explore these things a little bit.
Okay, so by the title, yes, it actually listening does take a lot of work and it takes a lot of skill to master or just to be able to do above average. Listening is an ethical responsibility and it follows three fragmentations of personal, social, and cultural. We also said that silence can be a lot about listening as well, and the relationship between speakers and listeners needs to be symbiotic for the conversation to work. And I like the quote, this was never a benign process, as he saw us participants, occasionally critics, sometimes creators, and oftentimes curious bystanders, linked within a mediated culture that fails to deliver its promises of communication and connection with enduring, powerful, and largely negative consequences for our status as human beings.
Yeah. Great, right? So one way to kind of think about this is, if you have ever done something like a customer survey, like you've contacted customer service and you've been like, this was not a good experience, this package was damaged, this food wasn't good, it expired, or whatever, right? And you've just had this experience where you've reached out to like a company, to customer service or whatever, and it just has not been a good time, right? An organization can say, we're available for listening, we have customer service people, but it can be like that Spectrum ad that I showed a skit about last time, right? Where you just get redirected, you get to run around, and it doesn't feel like there's an ability to really understand. So listening, right, only goes so far if we can't feel like it's created any sort of change or resolution to the things that we want to be heard. So I think you all hit on some good points here about sort of the combination of listening and action for sure. About the group here on this side.
For one, what are some of the key findings from this section? We found that people listen to look for evidence that disconfirms the other person's point of view. We listen to find we listen to attack the other person's beliefs and support our own. And then for two, what observations does Lloyd make about listening? And we noticed that are that in business context, we need to reevaluate listening and shape the cultural relations. We should care about what they are and saying rather than listening to attack. And the last one, how do these observations help us become better listeners? These observations make us become better listeners because we would then be able to fully comprehend what they're saying rather than not really trying to listen to them.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing, right? Listening for the disturbance and the idea that we oftentimes listen in an adversarial context is an important thing. As we talked about earlier about this kind of adversarial listening style that we do in a lot of public situations, sometimes our listening is not about understanding, but about disproving. We might think about the sort of radical listening approach that we talked about earlier in the class as an effort to try to withhold that level of judgment. But again, we do find ourselves oftentimes questioning the validity of what the person we're listening to says, right? We're critical of and using that not necessarily as a way of providing support, but a way to sort of negate what's being said. Sort of again, critiquing some of the ways that listening happens. And then how about the folks on Zoom? What did you notice about that conclusion section and some of the observations there?
For the first one, we looked at into the labor of listening, which is also can be an active and an open disposition to be revised over of social condition, which can be premised in a speech situation that can be accepted into the conflict conversation, which they can take it as a bad way. It used to be in a historical listening, but in the way that is being taken as a failure of listening can be also not taken in the wrong way, but also to improve the way to listen later in the future, where they can impact more how to listen than being misunderstood. And number two, we mostly dealt with with cultural sphere that can indicate about the person's personality or their aromatic in the way they communicate to their dynamics to be understood and then being misunderstood with the communication, which kind of can be reflected to the first question of the labor of listening, because basically people can be misunderstood of the way they listen, but also it can be in the way to improve it, not just being like, oh, this person doesn't know how to listen to the conversation right to make it take it as a wrong way, but it also can be like listening from a different perspective, but not being reflected towards that. And the third one, it can also listening be like an impactful way to improve the way they listen, not to be misunderstood, which can seek into a conversation when they go to one conversation to another is also a way to practice further listening, as well as like listen from other people's perspectives as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing for your group, right? Again, listening is this practice of falling forward. We critiqued last week that listening is not a binary. It's not, are you listening or aren't you listening? It's in what ways are you listening or expressing yourself? So that listening can be this kind of constructive experience. That maybe the way people express or listen non-verbally is not what you expect. Maybe they give a lot or a little feedback, or maybe the way that they listen is this part of continuous improvement and better understanding. So I appreciate you sharing, and again, helping us to think about how this reading is envisioning miscommunication or failure to properly listen as an opportunity for growth rather than finger waving, you're not listening, you should get better at listening, right? So to wrap up the things that we've talked about today, right? Listening has a lot of benefits, but it's not a cure-all. It doesn't fix everything. Instead, we can move from cure to care to discuss listening as a thing that helps us engage in society. Listening is impacted by material conditions, right? It's impacted by the sort of stuff and physical matter that we find ourselves engaging with. And that listening is an individual activity that can be combined with awareness about structures and institutions, right? It's one thing to listen and another to get paid enough that allow you to have a safe place in which you can exist as a human and be able to listen in the first place. So, and then combining these things is an important consideration. For next class, our final class meeting, we'll wrap up some key points and just put a bow on our discussion about the Lloyd reading. You can hang on to the individual brainstorming that you did at the beginning of class to help you through your writing, but I would like you to email or pass forward the work that you did in your groups if you haven't done so already. Make sure everybody's name is on it for attendance. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you for our last class meeting on Friday.